We're coming on the air with continuous coverage of an unfolding seismic catastrophe along the western edge of North America. For at least the past 10 minutes, listeners from California through Washington State and into Western Canada have reported sustained ground motion, power loss, and structural damage. Preliminary seismic data confirms a massive rupture along the Cascadia Subduction Zone, and this is not a single event. It is ongoing. I'm Alex Mercer, and we will remain with you as long as necessary.
I'm Sierra Lane. For those listening right now, especially in the affected regions, we know this moment is disorienting and frightening. Many of you are hearing this broadcast by battery-powered radios or car stereos because other connections have failed. We are receiving messages from people sheltering under tables, from families pulled over on highways, from hospital workers trying to keep patients calm as buildings continue to sway. Our role here is to keep information steady and human while the situation itself is anything but.
Initial automated readings place the primary rupture at a magnitude exceeding 9.1, with subsequent segments continuing to release energy north and south. This is consistent with a full-margin Cascadia event, something long theorized but never observed in the modern era. The Juan de Fuca plate is slipping beneath the North American plate across hundreds of miles. The shaking being reported is not sharp and brief. It is long, rolling, and persistent, which significantly increases structural damage.
That persistence is what people are describing over and over again. A listener in Eureka says it feels like being on a ship that won't stop pitching. In Portland, someone writes that they tried to stand and simply couldn't, that the floor kept moving sideways under their feet. There's fear, yes, but also a strange calm in some of these messages, as if people are realizing all at once that they have no choice but to endure this moment together.
We are approximately 20 minutes into confirmed rupture activity. Power grid operators across California, Oregon, and Washington have initiated automatic protective shutdowns. That means large portions of the grid are offline by design to prevent fires and transformer explosions. Major blackouts are now confirmed in Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, Sacramento, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. Cellular networks are failing both from physical damage and overload.
In those darkened cities, people are improvising. Messages mention candles being blown out by shaking, flashlights rolling off tables, children crying because the lights won't come back on. A parent in San Jose writes that they're sitting in a doorway with their 2 kids, counting breaths out loud because it gives them something to focus on. These small acts of steadiness matter more than they might seem.
Transportation infrastructure is already compromised. The California Department of Transportation reports automatic closures of multiple highway segments due to sensor-detected deformation. Interstate 5 has been shut down in several locations pending inspection. Early imagery from traffic cameras shows visible damage to overpasses in the Central Valley and southern Oregon. Rail traffic has been halted along the West Coast corridor as a precaution.
For people trying to move right now, that shutdown is terrifying. We're hearing from drivers who pulled over because the road appeared to ripple in front of them. A truck driver near Redding says he watched a concrete barrier crack lengthwise like wood. He stayed in his cab because he didn't know where else to go. That uncertainty is everywhere right now.
Coastal communities face an additional threat. Subduction earthquakes displace enormous volumes of seawater. Tide gauges from Crescent City to Newport are already showing rapid fluctuations. Tsunami warning centers have issued evacuation advisories for low-lying coastal zones in Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. These are precautionary but serious. Wave arrival times, if significant waves are generated, could be as little as 20 to 30 minutes in nearby areas.
That has triggered a different kind of fear. People are running uphill, not knowing if they're early or late, carrying pets, carrying children, carrying nothing at all. A message from a coastal volunteer firefighter says sirens are blaring but the ground is still shaking, making it hard for people to move quickly. He writes that some residents froze, not from disbelief, but from exhaustion after minutes of continuous motion.
We're now about 40 minutes into this event. The United States Geological Survey confirms this is the largest earthquake ever recorded in North America. Canadian authorities report severe shaking across British Columbia, with Vancouver Island experiencing pronounced uplift in some areas and subsidence in others. Ports along the Pacific coast have suspended operations due to concerns about seabed instability and damaged piers.
In Vancouver, listeners describe water sloshing out of pools, glass falling from high-rise buildings, and alarms echoing through downtown streets. One message simply says, "We're outside. Everyone is outside." That instinct to be together, even without answers, is something we see again and again in disasters.
Emergency declarations are being issued rapidly. The governments of the United States and Canada have both activated national emergency response frameworks. Military units are being placed on standby for domestic support roles, including search and rescue, logistics, and medical evacuation. Airspace over much of the West Coast is restricted as airports assess runway integrity.
Airports are emotional crossroads in moments like this. In Los Angeles, travelers are being ushered out of terminals into open areas. In Seattle, people report sitting on tarmac buses, unsure if they're safer inside or out. There are reunions happening in parking lots, and there are separations too when phones die and people lose track of one another in the confusion.
We are approaching the 1-hour mark since the initial rupture. Aftershocks are not discrete events. Instead, the fault continues to creep and lurch. This complicates response efforts. Fire departments are reporting dozens of small fires, particularly where gas lines have ruptured. Automatic shutoff valves have reduced risk in newer systems, but older infrastructure is vulnerable.
Fire is one of the fears people mention most often. A listener in Oakland writes that they smell gas but can't tell where it's coming from. They're afraid to light anything, afraid not to. Neighbors are knocking on doors, checking on each other, sharing information in the absence of reliable communication. This is community in its most raw form.
Casualty estimates are not yet available, and any numbers circulating should be treated with skepticism. Historically, in events of this scale, injuries outnumber fatalities in the early hours, but delayed medical care can change that equation. Hospitals are operating on emergency power. Some facilities report structural damage that limits their ability to accept new patients.
Inside those hospitals, staff are making impossible choices. A message from a paramedic says they're triaging in a parking lot because parts of the building aren't safe. They describe patients apologizing for their injuries as if being hurt is an inconvenience to others. That quiet dignity is something that stays with responders long after the shaking stops.
International monitoring agencies across the Pacific are now fully engaged. Japan, Chile, and New Zealand all report clear seismic signals from this event. Tsunami watches have been extended across much of the Pacific Basin. This is no longer a regional disaster. It is a global concern.
And yet, for the people listening right now, it's intensely local. It's the crack in the wall you can't stop staring at, the unanswered text message, the sound of something falling in the next room. We are still in the earliest hours when uncertainty is at its peak and information comes in fragments.
We will continue to verify those fragments and assemble a clearer picture as the hours progress. This is an evolving situation, and the next phase will bring more data, more damage reports, and difficult clarity about what has been lost and what remains.
Sierra Lane, stay with us. Conserve your phone batteries if you have them. Check on the people around you if it's safe to do so. You are not facing this alone, even if it feels that way in the dark.
We are now just past 2 hours since the initial rupture along the Cascadia Subduction Zone. Ground motion has diminished in intensity in some inland areas, but continues intermittently along the coast and offshore. Aftershocks above magnitude 7 are being recorded every few minutes. This confirms that the fault is still adjusting. Structural engineers advising state authorities warn that cumulative damage is increasing with each additional movement.
For people on the ground, that means there is no sense of resolution yet. Many listeners are writing that just as they begin to feel steadier, Another wave of motion hits, undoing whatever calm they've managed to build. A listener in Salem says they tried to lie down but couldn't tolerate the feeling of the floor shifting beneath them. They chose to sit upright instead, even though they're exhausted.
Emergency management agencies are beginning coordinated damage assessments where it is safe to do so. Initial reports indicate severe structural failures in older urban cores. In San Francisco, multiple sections of elevated roadway have collapsed or become impassable. In Los Angeles, water main ruptures are widespread, complicating firefighting efforts. Seattle officials report visible tilting in several downtown buildings, prompting expanded exclusion zones.
Those exclusion zones are forcing people to leave places they thought were safe. We're hearing from residents who were told to evacuate apartment buildings in the middle of the night, stepping out into cold air with only what they could carry. One message from Tacoma says a family wrapped their child in a bath towel because they couldn't find shoes in the dark. They weren't panicked, the parent writes, just very tired.
Power restoration efforts are limited by both damage and safety concerns. At this point, more than 30 million people across the western United States and Canada are without electricity. Telecommunications infrastructure is severely degraded. Emergency satellite links are being activated for government coordination, but public access remains limited. This communication blackout is expected to persist for days in some regions.
The silence created by that blackout is weighing on people. Several listeners mention the absence of familiar sounds, no traffic, no aircraft, no hum of appliances. One person in Fresno writes that the quiet makes every aftershock feel louder, more threatening. Another says they're afraid to sleep because they don't want to be caught unaware if something else happens.
We are now receiving preliminary tsunami impact reports. Coastal sensors indicate that while there was no single catastrophic wave, a series of strong surges struck low-lying areas. Portions of the Oregon and Washington coasts experienced inundation of several meters. Harbors in Astoria, Newport, and Grays Harbor report severe damage, with vessels torn from moorings and port infrastructure compromised.
In those coastal towns, displacement is already becoming a reality. People who evacuated uphill are being told they may not be able to return for days or longer. A listener from a small community near the Olympic Peninsula says dozens of families are sheltering in a high school gym, sharing blankets and snacks pulled from cars. They describe children asking when they can go home and no one knowing how to answer.
It's now been roughly 3 hours since the first reports. Casualty figures are beginning to emerge, though they remain incomplete. Based on hospital admissions and emergency calls, officials estimate tens of thousands injured across the region. Fatality numbers are expected to rise significantly as search and rescue operations reach collapsed structures. These figures will evolve, and they will likely worsen.
Behind every number is a story that hasn't fully surfaced yet. A message from a construction worker in Oakland says he helped pull a coworker from rubble using a jack and a length of pipe. They waited 40 minutes for an ambulance that never came, so they drove themselves. He doesn't know if his coworker will be okay, but he knows he couldn't leave him there.
Water infrastructure failures are compounding the crisis. Major aqueducts supplying Southern California have sustained damage. Reservoir levels are stable for now, but distribution systems are compromised. Boil water advisories are being issued where communication allows. In some inland valleys, ground subsidence has altered canal gradients, threatening agricultural water delivery.
Water is something people quickly realize they take for granted. Listeners are writing about filling bathtubs and every container they can find, not knowing when supply will return. In one message, a woman says she gave her last bottle of water to a stranger with a bleeding head wound because it felt like the only right choice. These moments of quiet generosity are happening alongside fear.
We are seeing the first signs of international humanitarian mobilization. Relief flights are being prepared in Australia and Europe, though arrival will depend on runway assessments. Naval vessels from the United States and Canada are repositioning to provide offshore support, including medical facilities and helicopter operations. This is a long-term response beginning to take shape.
For now, though, people are focused on the next hour, not the next week. A listener in Bakersfield says they're sitting in their car because it feels safer than their house, listening to this broadcast as a lifeline. They write that hearing steady voices helps them believe that someone still understands what's happening.
It's now approaching 4 hours since the initial rupture. Seismologists confirm that this event involved not just Cascadia, but stress transfer to adjacent faults along the western margin. Portions of coastal California and British Columbia are experiencing measurable land level changes. In some areas, the ground has dropped by more than a meter relative to sea level. This subsidence raises serious long-term concerns about flooding and permanent land loss.
That idea that the land itself has changed is difficult for people to grasp. A message from near Humboldt Bay says the shoreline looks wrong, that familiar landmarks seem lower, closer to the water. The listener writes that it feels like the earth quietly moved the goalposts while everyone was watching the shaking instead.
Government leaders are addressing the public where communication allows. Statements emphasize that this is a national emergency, that resources are being mobilized, and that patience will be required. Mandatory evacuations are expanding in coastal and flood-prone zones. Curfews are being enacted in some urban centers to reduce risk and facilitate emergency operations.
Curfews in a blackout are unsettling. People are being told to stay put when many already feel trapped. A listener in downtown Los Angeles says they hear shouting a few blocks away and don't know if it's fear, anger, or something worse. They lock their door not because they distrust their neighbors, they say, but because uncertainty makes everyone unpredictable.
Reports of isolated looting are emerging, but officials stress that these are limited and that the overwhelming majority of people are cooperating and helping one another. Law enforcement agencies are stretched thin, prioritizing life safety over property protection. National Guard units are deploying to assist with security, logistics, and rescue.
The presence of soldiers can be reassuring or frightening depending on who you ask. Some listeners say seeing uniformed personnel helped them feel less alone. Others say it made the situation feel suddenly very real, like something from history books rather than their own street. Both reactions are understandable.
We are now 5 hours into this event. The aftershock rate is slowly decreasing, but significant tremors continue. Engineers caution that many structures that survived the main shaking may still fail. People are being urged not to re-enter damaged buildings, even if they appear intact.
That warning is painful for those desperate to retrieve belongings or pets. We've received several messages from people who left animals behind in the rush to evacuate. One person writes simply, "I can hear my dog barking on the other side of the fence, and I don't know if I'm allowed to go back." There's no easy answer to that kind of question.
As night deepens across the West Coast, emergency shelters are filling. Schools, community centers, and stadiums are being converted into temporary housing. Capacity is already strained in major metropolitan areas. This displacement is likely to last weeks or months for many, depending on damage assessments.
In those shelters, people are meeting neighbors they've never spoken to before. A listener describes sharing a blanket with someone whose name they don't know, trading stories about where they were when the shaking started. There's grief in those conversations, but also a sense of solidarity that comes from surviving the same moment.
We will continue to track developments through the night. The next phase will bring clearer casualty counts, a better understanding of infrastructure loss, and early indications of how much of the coastline has been permanently altered.
If you're listening right now, know that exhaustion, fear, and numbness are all normal reactions. Take care of yourself and the people near you as best you can. This is not over, but you are still here.
It has now been approximately 8 hours since the initial rupture along the Cascadia Subduction Zone. Aftershock frequency has decreased, but significant tremors in the magnitude 6 to 7 range continue at irregular intervals. This confirms that the fault system is still redistributing stress. Engineers and geophysicists advising emergency agencies now believe the rupture extended farther offshore and deeper than early models suggested.
For people trying to rest, that uncertainty is draining. Many listeners say they haven't slept at all. A shelter coordinator in Sacramento writes that people lie down for a few minutes at a time, then sit back up when they feel movement, real or imagined. Parents are watching their children finally fall asleep on gym floors, afraid to close their own eyes in case something changes.
Updated infrastructure assessments are coming in as daylight begins to reach parts of the interior west. In California's Central Valley, subsidence has damaged levee systems protecting agricultural land. Several dams in Northern California and Southern Oregon are under emergency inspection after sensors detected abnormal strain. Officials stress that no catastrophic dam failures have been confirmed, but controlled water releases are underway as a precaution.
Communities downstream are reacting with quiet dread. People are being told to prepare for possible evacuation again, after already enduring one night of fear. A listener near a reservoir outside Redding says they packed their car twice, just in case. They don't know if the warning is real or simply another layer of uncertainty, but they can't afford to ignore it.
Casualty figures are being revised upward as search and rescue teams reach previously inaccessible areas. Current estimates suggest more than 80,000 injured across the western United States and Canada. Confirmed fatalities now exceed 12,000, with the majority occurring in densely populated urban areas and older coastal communities. These numbers are provisional and expected to rise.
Hearing those numbers spoken aloud is sobering. In the messages we receive, people rarely mention statistics. They mention names. A woman in San Mateo writes about her neighbor, an older man who didn't make it out of his apartment when it collapsed. She says he used to water everyone's plants when they were away. That's how people remember the loss, not as a number, but as a missing presence.
Daylight is revealing the scale of coastal change. Aerial surveys confirm that sections of the coastline from Northern California through Washington have permanently dropped relative to sea level. In some areas, the land has sunk more than 2 meters. Entire low-lying neighborhoods are now below the high tide line. These changes are not temporary. They represent permanent geographic loss.
For those communities, the word home is being redefined in real time. A listener from a fishing town in Oregon says their house is still standing, but the water now reaches the front steps. They ask whether that means they still live there. It's a simple question with no simple answer.
Ports along the Pacific coast remain largely inoperable. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach report severe damage to cranes and wharves. Seattle's port facilities are partially flooded due to subsidence. Vancouver's port has suspended all commercial traffic. This disruption will have global economic consequences, affecting supply chains far beyond the region.
That broader impact feels distant to people right now, but its edges are already visible. Shelters report shortages of specific medications and medical supplies. A diabetic listener says they're worried about insulin refrigeration as generators run low on fuel. These are quiet crises layered on top of the obvious destruction.
Military involvement is expanding. National Guard units are now active across California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. Their roles include search and rescue, distribution of aid, security at critical infrastructure sites, and medical support. Naval vessels positioned offshore are receiving evacuees from isolated coastal communities where roads are no longer passable.
Some of those evacuations are harrowing. A listener describes being ferried from a flooded town by small boat, stepping over debris and unfamiliar water where streets used to be. They say the silence on the boat was heavier than the noise of the quake because everyone was thinking about what they left behind.
We are now roughly 10 hours into the event. Communication is improving in some inland areas as temporary cell towers are deployed, but vast regions remain dark and disconnected. Emergency officials emphasize that the absence of information does not mean abandonment. It means access is physically limited.
Still, that reassurance is hard to absorb when you haven't heard from family. Several listeners ask us to read brief messages on air, hoping loved ones might hear. One message simply says, "We are safe near Fresno. Please don't come looking." That sentence carries both relief and sorrow.
International aid offers are formalizing. Search and rescue teams from Mexico, Japan, and several European nations are en route. Coordination is complex due to damaged airports. Runway inspections show cracking and uneven settling at major hubs, including San Francisco International and SeaTac. Flights are limited to military and emergency operations.
Airports, usually places of movement, have become places of waiting. People sleep on terminal floors under emergency lighting. A listener says they watched the sun rise through cracked glass and felt both grateful and unbearably sad. Gratitude for being alive, sadness for the world that no longer looks the same.
Scientific understanding of the event is sharpening. Geophysicists now believe that the Cascadia rupture triggered slow slip failure along adjacent offshore faults, leading to widespread subsidence rather than a single violent collapse. This explains why entire regions are gradually sinking instead of experiencing instant destruction. It also means the process may continue for days or weeks at a slower pace.
That idea that the ground might keep changing quietly is unsettling. People ask if it will ever feel solid again. A listener from near the coast writes that they keep watching the waterline, convinced it's inching closer even when it's not. Living with that vigilance is its own kind of trauma.
We are now approaching 12 hours since the first reports. Fatality estimates have climbed to over 20,000. Injuries exceed 150,000. Tens of millions remain without power. At least 5 million people are displaced, with numbers rising as coastal evacuation zones expand.
Displacement is not just about where you sleep. It's about identity. A listener who evacuated from a coastal town says they don't know what to tell their children when asked where they're from now. They're not ready to say the name of a place that might not exist anymore.
As morning advances, the focus is shifting from immediate survival to sustained response. Food distribution centers are being established. Water purification units are arriving. These efforts will save lives, but they cannot reverse what has already happened.
People understand that. There's grief in the messages now, less shock. Someone writes that they finally cried when they saw daylight on the damage. Another says they haven't cried at all and wonders if that means something is wrong. Both reactions are human.
We will continue through the day as assessments deepen and long-term consequences become clearer. The next hours will bring confirmation of which areas are lost, which can be rebuilt, and what this means for the future of the Pacific coast.
Stay with us as the second half of this first day unfolds. You are still being heard, even if the world feels very quiet around you.
It has now been approximately 14 hours since the initial rupture, and with daylight spreading across the entire affected region, the full scale of damage is becoming unavoidable. Aerial reconnaissance confirms widespread, permanent subsidence along the Pacific coastline, extending from Northern California through Oregon and Washington and into large portions of coastal British Columbia. In several locations, land has dropped between 2 and 4 meters. This is not erosion or temporary flooding. Geological teams are confirming that these areas have crossed a structural threshold and will not rebound. The continent itself has changed shape.
For the people who live there, that realization is devastating in a quiet, almost stunned way. Listeners are no longer asking when they can go home. They're asking whether home still exists. A woman evacuated from a coastal community near Coos Bay says she watched the tide come in and didn't recognize the shoreline anymore. She says it wasn't violent. It was slow. The water just kept coming, filling streets that had already cracked and sagged until the town felt like it was being erased gently but deliberately.
Updated casualty figures are now being released with greater confidence. As of this hour, confirmed fatalities across the United States and Canada stand at approximately 46,000. Emergency officials stress that this number will continue to rise as recovery teams reach submerged and collapsed areas. Injury estimates now exceed 300,000. More than 12 million people are displaced. These figures place this event among the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history for the region.
Behind those numbers are moments people will carry forever. A listener in Santa Cruz writes about helping an elderly couple evacuate, only to realize later they left behind photo albums because there was no room in the car. Another listener describes standing in line for water next to someone who lost their sibling overnight. They didn't speak. They just stood there together, because sometimes shared silence is the only language that fits.
Infrastructure collapse is now being documented in detail. Portions of the California aqueduct have failed, disrupting water delivery to Southern California. Multiple major dams narrowly avoided catastrophic failure but sustained damage that will require years of repair. Airports along the West Coast remain largely closed to civilian traffic due to runway deformation. Major ports are inoperable, effectively cutting off a critical artery of global trade. The economic impact is expected to reverberate worldwide for decades.
The loss of infrastructure isn't abstract to people right now. It shows up as empty pharmacy shelves, as hospitals rationing care, as families realizing they can't get the medication or equipment they rely on. A parent of a medically fragile child writes that they're grateful their child survived the quake, but terrified of what happens next if supply lines don't recover in time. Survival, they're learning, is not a single moment but an ongoing negotiation.
Military and civil authorities are transitioning from emergency response to sustained humanitarian operations. Large exclusion zones have been established along newly submerged coastlines. These areas are no longer considered safe for habitation. Governments of both the United States and Canada have acknowledged that some towns and cities will not be rebuilt in their original locations. Managed retreat is now official policy in multiple coastal regions.
Hearing that aloud is like a second shockwave. People are grieving places, not just people. A listener says they grew up believing the ocean was something you visited, something you admired from a distance. Now it feels like a force that quietly claimed their childhood neighborhood. There's anger in some messages, but more often there's a deep sadness, the kind that settles in once the adrenaline fades.
Scientific consensus is solidifying around the cause of the disaster. This was a full-margin Cascadia Subduction Zone rupture, compounded by secondary slow-slip failures along adjacent offshore faults. Instead of releasing all energy in a single instant, the system unraveled in stages, producing prolonged shaking and widespread subsidence. This explains why entire regions sank gradually, rather than collapsing outright. It also explains why warning signs were subtle until it was too late to prevent mass displacement.
That explanation doesn't make the loss easier to bear, but it does help people understand that this wasn't random or malicious. It was the planet doing what it has always done on a timescale humans struggle to live with. A listener writes that knowing this doesn't bring comfort exactly, but it does bring a strange sense of humility. They say it reminds them how temporary everything we build really is.
We are now 18 hours into the event. Fatality estimates have risen again, now approaching 60,000. Entire stretches of coastline are officially classified as lost. Portions of Northern California, Western Oregon, coastal Washington, and low-lying areas of British Columbia are permanently altered. Some island communities off the coast have partially submerged, their populations fully evacuated. No nation has vanished entirely, but significant portions of multiple countries are now underwater.
For evacuees, that reality is setting in slowly. Shelters are quieter now. People speak less. They stare at maps on phones when they can, trying to orient themselves in a world that no longer matches memory. A listener says they realized they were grieving when they caught themselves describing their town in the past tense. They hadn't meant to. It just happened.
Governments are issuing formal addresses acknowledging the scale of the catastrophe. These statements emphasize unity, long-term rebuilding, and international cooperation. They also acknowledge hard truths. Some losses are irreversible. Some communities will never return, and the recovery will span generations. These are measured words, chosen carefully, but their weight is unmistakable.
People hear those words and feel both reassured and hollowed out. There's comfort in knowing someone is planning for the future, but pain in realizing that future may not include everything you loved. A listener says they don't know whether to be grateful they survived or guilty that others didn't. That emotional conflict is everywhere right now.
We are approaching the 24-hour mark since the first reports. Final casualty estimates for this initial period are now being released. Approximately 72,000 people are confirmed dead. More than 500,000 are injured. Over 20 million are displaced across the Pacific coast of North America. The economic cost is incalculable. The geographic cost is permanent.
And yet there is life continuing in the midst of this. Babies born in emergency wards, neighbors cooking together on camp stoves, people sharing radios, sharing stories, sharing grief. One listener writes that they don't know what the world will look like in a year, but they know the person next to them helped them survive today. That feels important.
What ultimately caused this phenomenon was the long-anticipated release of tectonic strain along the Cascadia Subduction Zone, amplified by secondary fault failures that reshaped the coastline rather than destroying it in a single blow. This was not a mystery event. It was a known risk realized at its extreme.
What remains afterward is a changed world, smaller in some places, heavier with memory, but still inhabited by people who endured. Cities inland remain standing. Nations persist. The ocean has claimed land, but it has not claimed everything.
This concludes our continuous coverage of the first 24 hours of the West Coast Megaquake. The ground has settled for now. The losses are clear. The future will be difficult, but it exists.
To those who lived through this, your fear, your grief, and your resilience are real. This fictional broadcast ends here, but the human instinct to rebuild, remember, and care for one another is not fiction at all.
As we remain within the closing hours of this first day, authorities are refining what can now be stated with confidence. The tectonic system has stabilized into a slow, residual creep. There has been no further major rupture since the earlier aftershocks, and while minor tremors continue, they are no longer driving additional large-scale collapse. This stabilization allows engineers, emergency planners, and governments to transition from immediate life-saving operations to formal accounting. Maps released internally to response agencies show a visibly altered continental margin, with the Pacific having advanced inland in multiple shallow arcs rather than a single dramatic incursion. This slow drowning of land is what defined this event.
For people who lived through it, the slow pace is part of what makes it so haunting. Listeners say they expected destruction to be loud and final, but instead it was patient. Water rising inch by inch, streets becoming canals without a splash. A teacher evacuated from a coastal town writes that the school bell rang automatically during a power surge hours after the quake, even though no one was there. She says that sound broke her more than the shaking ever did because it reminded her how normal everything had been just one day ago.
Updated displacement figures now indicate that entire population centers have been permanently relocated. Coastal evacuation zones are no longer provisional. Governments have confirmed that these zones will remain closed indefinitely due to ongoing subsidence and saltwater intrusion. Agricultural land in low-lying valleys has been contaminated beyond near-term recovery. This will affect food production across North America for years. Emergency imports are already being negotiated to stabilize supply.
Displaced families are beginning to realize this is not a temporary shelter situation. A listener in a Northern California shelter says volunteers gently stopped using the word evacuation and started saying relocation. That word landed heavily. People understand what it means. It means enrolling children in new schools. It means jobs that may never come back. It means mourning not just what was lost, but the version of the future that depended on it.
Transportation authorities confirm that several major highways will not reopen in their original alignments. Rail corridors along the coast are considered total losses. Rebuilding, where possible, will require rerouting inland at significant expense. Airports that remain operational are now functioning as hubs for humanitarian logistics rather than civilian travel. Air traffic patterns across the Pacific are being permanently adjusted to account for altered infrastructure.
Travelers stranded far from home are confronting a new kind of limbo. A listener from another country says they arrived for a conference and now don't know when or how they'll leave. Strangers are offering couches, spare rooms, even just conversation. She says she's never felt so far from home or so deeply welcomed at the same time. Crisis has a way of stripping interactions down to their essentials.
Public health officials are issuing warnings about secondary risks. Contaminated water, disrupted sanitation systems, and crowded shelters increase the likelihood of disease outbreaks. Mental health resources are being integrated into emergency response plans, recognizing that psychological injury will far outlast physical wounds. These considerations reflect lessons learned from previous large-scale disasters, now applied at unprecedented scale.
The emotional toll is already visible. People describe sudden tears triggered by small things, a dropped cup, a familiar song on the radio, the smell of the ocean. A listener says they feel guilty laughing when someone makes a joke in the shelter, as if joy itself has become inappropriate. But then they laugh anyway because laughter reminds them they're still alive.
International observers note that while the physical losses are immense, the coordinated response has prevented even greater catastrophe. Early evacuation compliance, modern building codes in some regions, and rapid mobilization of reefs all reduced fatalities compared to worst-case projections. This does not diminish the tragedy, but it provides important context as nations evaluate preparedness for future seismic risks worldwide.
For survivors, comparisons to projections don't matter much right now. What matters is the person they can't reach, the street they can't return to, the quiet moments when adrenaline fades and reality settles in. A listener writes that they finally slept for 2 hours and woke up disoriented, forgetting for just a second what had happened. That second felt like a gift and a betrayal all at once.
As we approach the firm end of this 24-hour window, officials are clear that this was not the end of danger, but it was the end of the acute seismic phase. The continent will not continue sinking at the same rate. Coastlines will stabilize at their new boundaries. Reconstruction, where feasible, will begin with that understanding. This marks the boundary between disaster and aftermath.
People are already marking that boundary in their own ways. Writing names on shelter walls, sharing photos salvaged from phones, telling stories to make sure places that no longer exist are still remembered accurately. One listener says they described their town to someone who had never been there, just so it would feel real for a few minutes longer.
Within the first 24 hours, the final confirmed toll stands unchanged from the last accounting. Approximately 72,000 lives lost. Vast regions permanently altered. Multiple nations affected, though none erased. The cause is understood. The sequence is documented. The uncertainty that defined the early hours has given way to grim, durable clarity.
What remains after that clarity is responsibility to the dead, to the displaced, and to the future. Responsibility to remember accurately, to rebuild carefully, and to accept that the world has shifted in ways that cannot be undone. Listeners tell us they don't feel brave, they feel tired, but they keep going anyway, and that may be the truest definition of resilience there is.
This fictional broadcast now truly concludes within the first day of the West Coast Megaquake. The Earth has changed. Humanity has adapted, as it always does, not quickly, not easily, but persistently.
To everyone who listened through this imagined catastrophe, thank you for bearing witness. Even in fiction, attention is a form of care.
We are now approaching roughly 21 hours since the first rupture, and the operational picture has stabilized enough for governments to issue consolidated situation reports. These reports confirm that the seismic sequence has fully transitioned from active rupture to residual adjustment. Ground deformation is now measured in millimeters per hour rather than meters, but the implications remain severe. Coastal benchmarks indicate that the Pacific margin has permanently advanced inland by varying distances, from several hundred meters in rocky headlands to several kilometers in low-lying basins. This slow encroachment is ongoing in select areas, driven by compromised sediment layers rather than tectonic motion.
For people who lived in those basins, the experience feels less like a disaster and more like an eviction carried out by nature itself. Listeners describe watching familiar roads disappear under shallow water that reflects the sky as if nothing is wrong. One person writes that the stillness is unsettling, that they expected waves or noise, but instead the water arrived like it was always meant to be there. That quiet has left many people feeling unmoored, as though grief has no clear moment to attach itself to.
Emergency planners are now categorizing losses into 3 tiers. Tier 1 includes areas expected to be reoccupied after stabilization and repair. Tier 2 includes zones requiring long-term mitigation, such as seawalls or elevation projects, before any return is possible. Tier 3, which includes multiple coastal towns and districts, is classified as unrecoverable. These designations are provisional but represent the first formal acknowledgement that retreat is not a temporary strategy, but a permanent one for parts of the continent.
That word, unrecoverable, appears again and again in messages from listeners who heard it for the first time today. One person says it feels like being told a loved one won't wake up. Another says they understand the logic, but not the timing. That hearing it less than a day after losing everything feels unbearably fast. There's a sense that grief is being asked to keep pace with logistics, and it simply can't.
Updated humanitarian figures indicate that shelter capacity across inland California, Nevada, Arizona, and parts of Western Canada is nearing saturation. Governments are coordinating secondary relocations farther east, with rail and air corridors prioritized for displaced populations rather than goods. This marks a historic internal migration event, one unfolding not through sudden flight, but through structured movement under emergency authority.
For the people being moved again, it feels like losing control in stages. A listener says they were relieved to reach a shelter, only to be told they would need to board another bus in the morning to make room for new arrivals. They say they're grateful for safety, but exhausted by the constant transition, by never knowing how long they're allowed to stay still.
Hospitals are now reporting a shift in case profiles. Earthquake-related trauma is declining, while dehydration, exposure, infections, and stress-related conditions are increasing. Medical staff warn that this secondary wave of harm can be just as lethal if resources are not sustained. Field hospitals are being established near major displacement centers to relieve pressure on damaged urban facilities.
In those field hospitals, care looks different than people expect. A listener who volunteered to help translate for displaced families says much of the work is simply listening. People talk while bandages are changed, while IVs drip, while they wait. They talk about where they were born, about storms they survived before, about how strange it feels to need help at all. Being heard, they say, seems to matter almost as much as the medicine.
Economic assessments released in preliminary form suggest that this event has permanently altered the balance of trade along the Pacific Rim. With multiple ports offline indefinitely, shipping routes are being rerouted thousands of kilometers south. Analysts caution that shortages will not be immediate everywhere, but price instability is inevitable. Governments are coordinating price controls on essential goods to prevent exploitation during the recovery phase.
Those controls are already shaping daily life. Shelters are distributing ration cards not because supplies are gone, but because fairness matters. A listener writes that standing in line with everyone else, knowing no one gets extra, strangely helps them feel human again. In disaster, equity becomes emotional as much as practical.
As the 24-hour mark approaches, officials confirm that no further large-scale evacuations are planned unless new environmental thresholds are crossed. This brings a measure of predictability, even if the news itself is grim. Coastlines have settled at their new boundaries. Flood maps are being redrawn. The acute phase of uncertainty has ended.
That certainty brings its own weight. People are no longer bracing for what might happen next. They're sitting with what already has. A listener says the fear has faded, replaced by a heaviness that makes even simple decisions feel difficult. They ask if that's normal. It is. When adrenaline leaves, reality arrives quietly and stays.
We are now within the final hour of this first day. Confirmed figures remain stable. Approximately 72,000 fatalities. More than 20 million displaced. Significant portions of the Pacific coastline permanently altered. Multiple nations affected, none destroyed, all changed. The cause is fully understood and documented. A full-margin Cascadia Subduction Zone rupture, compounded by slow-slip deformation that reshaped land rather than shattering it.
What remains after this first day is a world that still turns, still feeds its people, still tells stories, but does so with less land and more memory. Listeners write that they don't know what tomorrow looks like, but they know what today felt like, and they don't want that to be forgotten. Remembering, they say, feels like the first step toward rebuilding something that makes sense again.
We will remain with this story beyond this broadcast, but within this fictional narration, the first 24 hours are drawing to a close. The emergency has become history. The response has become routine. The losses are now part of the record.
And for the people inside that record, life continues in fragments, in conversations, in shared food, in borrowed radios, in the long process of learning how to live on ground that no longer feels familiar.